I'm delighted to welcome Tim Smit, Matt Wolfe and Kathelin Gray, who will be in conversation around Tim's virtual kitchen table. And just wait till you're all online. Lovely. Okay, so we will hand over the reins to you and we'll come back in a little while, in about 35 minutes or so, with some questions. But thanks very much. We'll see you soon.
Goodbye, everybody, and hello and welcome, Matt and Kathelin from New York City. This is a great thrill for me to have you both on our conversation, because it's such a rare treat to be able to look people in the eye and say, hey, I'm a massive fan of what you've done, and Matt, I'm a massive fan of the marvelous film you have made. We call it Kitchen Table Conversations because the Eden Project was actually created around kitchen table conversations between people of very different backgrounds, chewing the cud, working through various different versions of what they saw the future as being, and we ended up with the Eden Project that we have today. And I've long been a fan of Biosphere 2, because in the early days, as we were doing the original planning for the Eden Project, I met Johnny Allen at the October Gallery in London and Kathelin, and they invited me to an extraordinary event at a place called La Marronnière, a chateau in Aix-en-Provence, where I had been promised I would meet people that are different from all walks of life, from all different experiences. And I'd been so used to this kind of bullshit from other people and actually arriving to find just the normal culture of people, that I was rather taken aback to find myself in the company of a Russian cosmonaut, an Egyptian geoscientist who was a world expert on extra sensing, deep space sensing, who had actually discovered an enormous amount of archaeology in the Sahara, and the editor of the New York Times. And this was just a few of the extraordinary people who were gathered there to talk on the principle that what was on the road stayed on the road. So what I'm hoping that this afternoon's conversation will be what's on the road definitely comes straight off the road, and is the beans are spilt with the public who are watching it. Now, Matt, you're the director of Spaceship Earth. It's been a real triumph. I can't remember something that captured the imagination quite like this in the intelligent press. I'm looking here at 5. Basically, you've got complete nap with all the 5 broadsheet papers, all saying what a very interesting and exciting and illuminatingly important film it is. So we chatted before, everybody, and I wanted to give Matt the chance, because he's not shy at coming forward, that if he had 3 minutes, you can have a bit of more liberty, 3 minutes to explain to all the uninitiated, what is Spaceship Earth all about? Go.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me, Tim. Basically, I was doing research online, and I came across these 8 images of people in this image of 8 people in bright red jumpsuits standing in front of a glowing glass pyramid. And I genuinely thought that was from a science fiction film, but quickly realized that it was real, and that the glowing structure was Biosphere 2, and that these 8 people had lived inside of it sealed for 2 years. I was 9 years old when the first mission of Biosphere 2 commenced. And so I had no recollection of it. But when I discovered the rich backstory of Biosphere 2 and all of the activity that led up to that project, and also the vision behind Biosphere 2, I was intrigued, to say the least. And, before long, I was at Synergia Ranch, a place that Kathelin helped founded and built, and still lives part-time. And when I arrived at Synergia Ranch, I met some of the folks who are in the film. And I was astounded to find an enormous archive of hundreds of 16mm films and analog videotapes and thousands of images, because I think this group recognized that what they were doing was historically significant. And I felt that I was in a position now, coming from a new generation, to reappraise Biosphere 2 and to really try to look at it in the context of catastrophic climate change. Of course, no one could have expected that we would be in a global quarantine at this time too. And I think the idea of 8 people confined inside not a small space, but a miniature world feels pretty prescient right now. So just tiny bit of context for those that don't know, Biosphere 2 was an experiment in ecologically closed systems. The project engaged in a kind of whole systems approach of science, creating distilled essences of all the biomes from the world, anything from a tropical rainforest to an ocean with a living coral reef and a desert. And a group of 8 enterprising scientists, ecologists, researchers, adventurers, artists went inside, and they conducted a number of experiments observing and measuring aspects of their atmosphere and the plant life and species inside, but also creating food to sustain for 2 years from half an acre plot of land, and to figure out how to make this system work. In so many senses, it was a microcosm of planet Earth, which they called Biosphere 1. And in a lot of ways, what happened to Biosphere 2 is instructive for how we might all be stewards for the planet today.
Marvelous. Gosh, you did that very, very well. Kathelin, obviously you were there right at the beginning. And obviously I've talked often with you about the things you remember in terms of the setting it all up. I wonder whether, as a sort of 2 or 3 minute setup, you could talk about a bus stop and rain and meeting a man, and you had a book, and that kind of started a journey that would eventually end up at Biosphere 2.
Yeah, so we're talking about 1967, and I was just out of high school, barely. I was dancing in San Francisco, but I had been raised around scientists, geologists particularly, but other scientists, and was very keen on people of different disciplines coming together. It seemed to be a part of my life. So when I was given a book called Mount Analog by the surrealist René Daumal, it told a story of people from very diverse backgrounds, a small group who convened in Paris in order to launch an expedition into the unknown to find an island in the South Pacific that didn't appear on any map. And I remember the actress, one of the characters, her name was Judith Pancake. So there were all sorts of people, and I really identified with that. And I wanted to do just that. So I was holding it under my arm at a bus stop, and I encountered this man who was about 20 years older than me, who was kind of raw-boned with that fire, like an exploration geologist, like Walter Houston in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And it turned out we were both going to the Civic Center. So we spent time on the bus discussing what our life's aims were. And he was on his way to Australia to start something. And I said, come with me to my rehearsal and then go around the corner to a place called Haight Street, as Haight Ashbury, and then knock on my door, because it turned out he was staying with a friend just next to me just next to my flat in North Beach. Knock on my door, and then we'll invite all of our friends to join us and start this Mount Analog kind of venture here in San Francisco. So he did, and that night he knocked on my door, and about 2 weeks later, he had called friends from New Mexico, where he had lived, and I called some dancer friends. And in August in 1967, we moved in together with the idea of starting kind of a radically new kind of social experiment, as it were, an effort to look at the foundations of civilization and our relationship with, we didn't call it the biosphere then, but with nature and the relationship of humans in nature. John was trained as a metallurgist. And so, geologists, metallurgists obviously are very connected with the earth and with these long-term cycles. And he also was a student of history, a student of revolution, of all kinds of history of different cultures. And, I was 17. And so the people that came together in that house in San Francisco we talked about either doing some kind of business thing that we're kind of consciously sympathetic to the earth, or to work on more kind of a science-oriented project, or the arts. And I said, unless there was performance involved, I didn't want to be involved, because I was convinced that the key to studying humans was in the performing arts. It was my experience. It fascinated me. And the dramas that we all engage in. And somebody said, let's do all of it. And that was like, all of it? Whoa. And so the succeeding years, we bought the land that became Biosphere 2 in 1984, I think, 85. And what's known as the Biosphere 2 first experiment with those 8 biospherians launched in 1991. So between 1967 and the mid-'80s, we purchased this land in New Mexico, first of all, as the mothership, and then began a series of other projects in different biomes: the mountain, the desert, the savanna, the tropical jungle, the ocean, in order to understand with dirt under the fingernails what the key issues were in each of these areas, in areas, kind of a frontier area culturally, and to be able to start to get an idea of what it actually takes, what it means to say, I'm a planetary citizen. That was the objective. So those decades were devoted to creating these projects, creating management groups for these different projects, including the October Gallery in London, by the way, our World City project.
Can I interrupt you at this point?
Yeah.
I feel I need to, because you've leapt rather fast to something very interesting. Before we went on air, I was reading a tiny bit of the excellent review from Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian, in which he says, if ever there was a documentary in the spirit of lockdown, it is this colossal eco-experimental project in the Arizona desert in the early 90s, with its roots in 60s counterculture. Now, what is interesting, when I was talking to Matt, we were talking about the fact that actually it rather misunderstands who you were, because you weren't hippies, you were actually very realistic, weren't you? And Matt said, well, I think perhaps the word that you might have used is enterprising, or if it was being said now, it'd be conscious capitalism. And then rather startlingly, and I've been thinking about it ever since you started talking, it in fact is the sort of spirit that imbues what is now what you might call the dot-com culture in the west coast of America. And I wonder if I could just move over for a moment to Matt. Do you recognize the Biosphere 2 that you filmed in the words of Kathelin and what drove her at the start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of what attracted me to this story is that this group, who we called the Synergists, they called themselves that, among other things at the time, that they really defied our traditional categories of hippies and counterculture. They did go back to the land, but for instance, they did no drugs, unlike other communes of the period. They didn't want to be called a commune. They were called a ranch. And they were workaholics, pursuing all sorts of enterprises and, intellectual kind of development as well, and doing theater. It was a kind of comprehensive culture surrounding this group. And what was unique about them is that they forged a partnership with somebody named Ed Bass early on. Ed had come from a Texas oil family, but was living in New Mexico. He actually got a lifetime membership to Kathelin's Theater of All Possibilities group. And he became a kind of benefactor or angel investor in the projects that they pursued. One of the first projects they did prior to Ed's investment was they built an enormous ship called the Heraclitus. It's a phenomenal aspect of the story that is one of my favorite parts of this group. And they used that ship to travel around the world to start up business enterprises in all the different biomes, from a hotel in Kathmandu to thousands of acres of Australian grasslands. And much of these projects were partnerships with Ed. And what they did is they synthesized ultimately into the idea of Biosphere 2, which would be an enterprise to pilot Mars colonization, but it also was conceived to model sustainable living on Earth. And part of its business plan was that they would develop green technologies out of Biosphere 2. So in a lot of ways, as you were saying, this was that kind of disruptive model of .com culture, but maybe 10 or 15 years before that time. It's in the .com sector that we see people, working outside of mainstream and established institutions or the government, and breaking rules or breaking things as they're known to create innovation. So this model was pretty atypical, and there was no significant precedent for it. But in fact, so much of the kernels of the .com culture and the development of technology stem from the counterculture. And that's a history that people aren't as familiar with.
That's a very, very interesting point. I mean, Kathelin, I don't know whether you agree with that. I mean, for me, as a, if you like, a bit wet behind the ears wannabe polymath, meeting all of you at the October Gallery in London was a complete revelation. I mean, for a number of reasons. One was that the members were all very well read across a lot of different subjects. And also the gallery itself, any of you watching who have not been to the October Gallery, it is a most singular place. It is, it has rooms, and if you arrive of an evening to stay and you haven't got a social engagement, you're invited to eat with the crew that are there. So on any particular night, you could be dining with an artist from Papua New Guinea who works in welding art made out of the bumpers of old-fashioned American cars, or a French biologist, or anything. I mean, it's the most extraordinary place. And it came to represent in my mind something very fevered. And when you look at the people that you've worked with, if anybody needs to be assured of the serious credentials of the Ecotechnics team, you've got Jeffrey Bateson, one of the great psychological anthropologists. You've got Dick Evans Schultes, who, in my view, is possibly the greatest anthropologist that ever lived, and ethnobotanist. And of course, our very own Professor Sir Ian Prance, who, of course, was hugely influential to what we did at the Eden Project. And at the time that we met him, he was director of Kew. But of course, before that, the time that you started Biosphere 2, he was the director of the Botanic Gardens of New York. And he has maintained, from the moment I've met him, he has maintained that the misrepresentation of Biosphere 2 may in history go down as one of the greatest shames in American culture, because he believed that you were way ahead of your time and that there were reasons why the story of Biosphere 2 came to be told in that particular way. And that is, of course, one of the reasons why we're so grateful to Matt for having redressed that imbalance. So going back to you and these marvelous projects you developed and skated over, I mean, they're bloody big projects. So give us the sort of capitalist, enterprising, conscious capitalism viewpoint of where you were as a creative artist and realizing that you needed to be independent. Take us through really quickly all the projects you built, because they're pretty cool.
Well, there's the October Gallery, which you mentioned. There's the research vessel Heraclitus. The gallery was founded in 1979. We built the 82-foot, 25-meter research vessel in 1975, and it sailed around the world for 40 years. There's a 1,000-acre sustainable forestry project in Puerto Rico, which is ongoing, where we planted 40,000 hardwood trees 40 years ago now. And there's the hotel in Kathmandu that we did in collaboration with Tibetan friends there. There were 2 projects in the Kimberley for sustainable forestry and sustainable ranching as well, ecologically based ranching. There is the Chateau in Aix-en-Provence, which is that's the Mediterranean Biome Project. It's an organic farm, and they have studio for sculpture and for workshops. And there's a ranch in New Mexico, which is 160 acres and is the home ship of the Ecotechnics gang, and also holds our archives and many other of it's the home base of the Institute of Ecotechnics, as is the October Gallery in London.
So viewers will be wondering, how did people who had such wide different range of interests and skills organize themselves in such a way that you ended up with, leaving aside Biosphere 2, with significant capital? How did the conversations go to make that possible?
You mean to make Ed Bass interested in investing?
Yeah, but afterwards also you swapped him out, didn't you? When you finally.
Yeah, and sure, and we did the ranch and the ship before we met Ed Bass, and our first venture with Ed was actually in 73, 74, before we built the ship. And we finished a house that we had a construction company, and we finished a house that he was in the process of building. And then we launched in a joint venture to build ecological condominiums in Santa Fe. So at that stage, he joined kind of the core group, and the financial model at that time was invest in real estate, buy low. For example, the gallery was a building that had many, many problems in an area. Bloomsbury now is very attractive now, but then nobody was interested in that area near Russell Square. So, and the same in the Kimberley, it was badly eroded pasture land that we committed to improving. So we would improve the original real estate, and the idea was that the investment, the financial investment, was paired with sweat equity, which is it's an important concept in the late 60s and onwards, where people who don't have money but have a lot of time and enthusiasm really put their blood, sweat, and tears into working on something. And then the idea is you divvy up any profits that are made, but you have kind of equal you have an interest in it. So our general concept was you have as much say in a project as the responsibility you actually take. So yes, the kitchen table, by the way, is a key symbol, in San Francisco. I remember we would all pound on this big farmhouse table in our kitchen in near Japantown and say, as long as we have a table of this charisma in whatever else we do, we'll be okay, So you have people joining in and expressing their opinions. You have, Johnny was definitely a leader type, and he was a very detailed student of history. So, and had a whole professional career before we all got together. There's a lot of youth. Youth is important, which may segue into a discussion about education, because a lot of us didn't really know what we want, what our true interests were. Mark Nelson studied philosophy at Dartmouth, and now he has a doctorate in ecological engineering. So when you're young, you need an arena to fuck up, to make mistakes, to pursue interest, to find out what other gifts you may have, but you need to be free to make mistakes, because you could play an important role in an enterprise and completely screw it up and be cast out, making way for someone who did have more natural expertise. But that kind of thing kind of went on throughout our project. So for example, the gallery, just the last bit, the gallery was founded as for the theater company, but that didn't make any economic sense. In 1979, London, it evolved into the important gallery that it's been for the last decades, by the people Chili Hawes, the director, growing. Elizabeth Lalouchek, whom you know well, artistic director, joining in. So it grows from the core management. The project is formed from the people.
No, I think one of the lovely things about you and your gang is you are as well connected as if you'd been in the White House, probably better. Whenever I talk to you about, I know so-and-so, I know so-and-so. Oh, yeah, them. Yes, I was having lunch with them the other day. And what I've always loved about you guys is that you've never been for sale. You've never been particularly impressed by people with money or power or influence, but you've always been more impressed by ideas, which I think is very endearing. And now, Matt, we've been keeping you silent for a while. You've probably gone to sleep. This marvelous film of yours, there is a moment where you capture Mr. Bannon on film. I'm going to ask Kathelin to say a bit about it later, but with the benefit of hindsight and where you sit in, obviously, is it rude to say with a New York state of mind? I don't know whether you do have one, or whether that's insulting.
I do, yeah.
Marvelous. So I suddenly realized I was actually going onto very thin ice there. This could have been offensive. How do you read, in hindsight, the story of Biosphere 2, its ambitions, its aspirations? And I mean, one of the things that struck me is, forgive me if this offends Americans, but I did have this sense in this whole Ed Bass thing, and when the battle begins and watching the film, of the script that was being mouthed as spoken of was completely different to what was going on under the surface. It felt to me like a bunch of alt-right Texans who were offended by the notion of bodily function and sex, and the notion that there might be such a thing as desire. And it all got very messed up. And then science was used as the weaponry. Did I get that right as a sort of weird left?
I mean, I take a kind of different stance, but I think basically, to me, I think Biosphere 2 represents a certain kind of idealistic human ambition to literally reimagine the world. And I wanted to celebrate that. But with hindsight, think that Biosphere 2 is also a cautionary tale about the compromises and potential limitations when one works with on a huge scale under the gaze of the international media. And that at the end of the day, Biosphere 2 didn't necessarily prove to be both ecologically and economically sustainable. And as the bottom line came into focus in the context of growing media criticism, Ed Bass chose to take over the project and to make it into something more conservative or more traditional. And was handed to me on a metaphor on a platter that it was Steve Bannon, the kind of contemporary political villain who actually facilitated that takeover. And to me, that's a metaphor of the takeover of Biosphere 1, our planet. It's often the forces of economics and politics that sabotage vanguard ideas and that are, creating the conditions in which we face catastrophic climate change.
Gosh, you don't pull your punches there. Other than that, did you think, what other mistakes did they make?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the biggest kind of shortcoming of the project was with kind of public relations. I think that at the end of the day, I don't think this group was prepared to have this level of media attention, and that the goals and objectives of the experiment are kind of multi-layered and complex and nuanced. It's trying to do lots of things all at once and in a kind of grand way. And I think at the end of the day, the messaging around the project and the media became nothing goes in and nothing goes out. And it kind of stoked a reality television kind of fascination that once things didn't go as planned, stoked the skepticism of the mainstream media. And that kind of narrative around Biosphere 2 in some sense spiraled out of control. So I think that was the ultimate shortcoming of Biosphere 2, is that it became a little too big for its own good, in a sense, in the public imagination.
Right. Kathelin, do you agree with that?
I totally agree with Matt, completely. I think that I know that we were unprepared with the scale of scrutiny. Somewhere we thought that because we're in the mountains in the desert outside of Tucson, that we would avoid all of this, media thing. But on the other hand, there they were with their Flash Gordon red jumpsuit. So, is it, and I was like, no, it's got to be khaki. Mission 2, they were dressed in khaki. But so you have this, here we are, space heroes out of a comic book in a sense, and we're serious scientists. And then what, then they entered this world, which was very serious science. It was observational, kind of Darwinian approach to science. So all the naysayers, of course, had their opportunity to come out and give their critique for something that had never been done before. So I totally agree with Matt that we should have, from a PR point of view, emphasize that, look, guys, this is an experiment. It's Kitty Hawk. Is this going to fly at all? We're going to aim to be closed for 2 years. The overall aim is to be materially closed, energetically and informationally open. But when Jane Poynter brings that duffel bag through, that was like a media scandal suddenly. We were completely unprepared. Also, Matt's point about scale, I totally agree with that. It was very difficult, and it was something that we talked about. If we succeed, the group as it is, and our ambitions for a small group-based style civilization, synergetic civilization, as we defined it, is based on small groups, that could be in danger. So we could be in danger, or if we fail, we could be in danger. And I think it's a triumph that, the people do talk to each other, they're friends, people's lives have moved on. But now, 25 years after Biosphere 2, we still talk to each other and do things together, because it could easily have been not that at all. So I agree very much with Matt's analysis of what went wrong. The scale of capital, it's a lot of money. And for Ed Bass, it was something like 10% of his annual income. But nevertheless, 200 million is a lot of money. And so you're going to have all of those interests, the guardians of as the Marxists would say, congealed capital,
Gosh, if I had 10% of my annual income at 200 million, I'm not sure I'd worry that much. But
the annual expenditure was 10%. Yeah.
It's fascinating because when I watched your film, Matt, one of the things, I have only got to know Johnny latterly. I'm talking about the late 1990s, and undoubtedly he's charismatic. And there's a scene in the film with Johnny and, forgive me, what's the lady in charge of Biosphere 2, the CEO? Margaret
Augustine.
Yeah, in which they were doing something you felt like screaming at the screen, don't do it, where the right thing, exactly what Matt was saying, the right thing was to say, you know what, we've actually had to make some compromises, admit it all, so this is what it is, it's still a great experiment. And they decide to do the very opposite, which is to deny everything and go like that, and you go, crikey. I think Matt's got a great point with that PR thing, but I wonder whether the PR thing about expectations would still have been overcomable if there hadn't been this insistence on a kind of purity to the project, which could never have been sustained. Matt, as the observer, what do you think of that? You do that so well. That whole, I felt very tense. It was like a boxing match at that stage in the film.
I think that what the project was actually trying to do probably couldn't have been conveyed clearly on Good Morning America. And sometimes what I think is like the theater of all possibilities doesn't really belong on Good Morning America. I think just the nature and scope of the project attracted a very mainstream audience. I think about that as a filmmaker. I operate at a particular scale. I don't want to make $200 million films that aim to reach everybody. I look to do something that reaches a smaller group of people at a more modest scale. And I think Biosphere 2 became a really mainstream phenomenon. And these weren't necessarily mainstream people. They were engaging in an experiment on all sorts of levels, a kind of life experiment together as a collective, an experimental form of total systems science as opposed to reductionist science, and also a human experiment. And it's hard to explain and to break down all of those things in the mainstream media. And I think that regardless of the particularities of the communication or the ways in which the management went on the defense, that at the end of the day, the public was going to see it in pretty simplified terms. And this was a project that wasn't simple.
Yeah, you have to remember that in actuality, the main focus of the management was to run Biosphere 2. And so the PR, I mean, Margaret at Johnny, he was looking to coordinate the science inside. It was a major, major experiment. And to also deal with the PR at that time, I think, it's almost like a whispering circle, when you try to figure out what actually happened at that point. But their attention was firmly in trying to make things work. And the PR was one aspect of it.
So did Johnny forgive Ed Bass, or did he feel that his brutal removal was completely unjustified and he was angry forever? What was his personal response?
I would say, speaking for him, which who knows, I'm not Johnny, but he was very angry. All of us were angry. I was angry at Ed. There was no earthly reason to do the takeover in the way that it was done. I mean, we'd had a series of board meetings before that and discussions, and we knew that the Texans were circling the bankers and all of that. We had many other options. So the anger, and also why demean the project itself in the subsequent press? Why not say this was a grand experiment and it is very, very important historically, and now we're doing something else? And that just, I still don't understand why that happened. I can only think that Ed was overwhelmed. But so yes, Johnny has forgiven Ed, and yes, there is anger and grief. Not just with Johnny, but with I think all the people who were seminal in creating Biosphere 2.
Right. Well, Matt, another brutal question for you to answer with as much diplomacy as the distance between you and Kathelin will allow. As an observer of what happened at Biosphere 2, do you think that the way it ended actually, in effect, killed the spirit of whatever it could have become? Therefore, that whatever Ed Bass may have wished to do, that the science that has gone on there afterwards pales into insignificance between the scale, the size of the idealism at the start. Have I phrased that? Do you know what I mean by that? Have I been clear?
Yeah, I mean, to me, Biosphere 2 has been kind of regarded as this spectacular failure in collective memory, which I felt was unfair. That's part of what motivated me to make the film. The ultimate failure of Biosphere 2, from my point of view, is that it's not being used as the apparatus it was designed to be, a whole system. The biomes has been split into kind of individual pieces, and it's open to tourists. So to me, that's a failure in a certain extent. But the fact is, this thing was built. It was a crazy, crazy idea on just an unprecedented scale. And the group of people who were speaking about built it. And that itself is an amazing human accomplishment. And the Biosphereans, despite incredible criticism and both, ecological and interpersonal calamities, they completed their 2-year mission. They easily could have left, but they stayed. And so to me, I was really inspired by that. So despite the shortcomings or the kind of criticism of Biosphere 2, I think in the end, the goal of my film was to reappraise the project and to spark the idealism that we all need to hold on to now if we're going to reimagine the world.
I see Rose there, but I just want to bring those two together in a comment, which is that I think the greatest grief that not only Johnny but all of us have is seeing the entire reason that we we just manically built these projects, and then Biosphere 2 was in order to prepare to offer a demonstration for what humanity could do, the kind of thing that humanity could do in the face of certain ecological devastation. And basically nothing has been done. That project was destroyed as is. And to see, the icebergs melting, et cetera, that whole, the whole great catastrophe that we find ourselves in now, the climate crisis, is the greatest grief of all. But we know, I did what I could, and I do what I can. So that's the best that any of us can do, is what we can.
You did good. And Matt did good with the marvelous film. And anybody who hasn't seen it watching this tonight, shame on you. Get to see it as quickly as you can. Matt said something which he forgot to say right at the end. He said some marvelous words, which I will have to paraphrase because I want to make him try to remember, but that perhaps one of the greatest contributions of Biosphere 2 to science itself is it redefined the nature, the breadth and ambition of the very word experiment, and created within that definition a kind of polymathic, transdisciplinary vision of maybe something that the world will now pick up. I know certainly for all the Edenites watching this, we are inspired by what you stand for, and hope that we can pick up that mantle and do it justice. And I will certainly also be on the phone to Matt about how, if you have huge ambitions, can you break it down into bite-sized elephant chunks in order to reach a very large audience, but no one actually knowing that that's what you're trying to do. So I know he doesn't want to have a $200 million film, but I hope by accident he does. Kathelin, thank you so much for, as ever, being a wonderful companion and a conversationalist. I hope our paths cross again very soon. And I don't know, Rose, what's the score on the doors? What, are we waiting for anybody to say anything to us, or are you about to detonate us and we disappear into oblivion?
I'm not about to detonate you just yet. I've got a couple of questions that I'd really like to ask before we do sign off for the evening. So to you, Tim, first, you mentioned obviously that the whole project around Biosphere 2 will resonate a lot with Edenites, and it absolutely does. As a member of Team Eden, there's a lot of parallels. The ambition and everything there's so much similarity there. So kind of a bombshell question to you, I suppose, and something you were recently talking about. So the ousting of John Allen and that team towards the end was just really brutal, and it felt like from the outside that it ripped the culture and the DNA out of the project. And I was wondering, is that something that you are concerned about ever happening at Eden?
Thanks. Swallowing hard. Thank you, Rose. I've considered what would happen if that happened. And because we're a very close crew, I think it would destroy Eden. And that's not about me, because Eden, as you know, is not just about me. But I do think there is a kind of cultural glue that we provide for each other. That is not to say that someone else miraculous might not come in and make it much, much better. I think the art is for us to grow and bring people in and take on different hues as we grow. I think one of the greatest dangers is to become smug, that you think you've got it right, and then you surround yourself with other people who think you're right. And that's just tremendously comfy, and it's actually a recipe for your own self-destruction, which is a different question to should Eden, I prefer the question to be, should Eden be concerned that a number of people at the head of it are becoming old farts, and it is far more important that the project lives and thrives and grows than that it actually panders to the vanity of the oldsters who want to stay in control for far too long. And that is a very real issue. And I like to think that we are actually addressing that as we speak, in terms of seeing how we can have new forms of leadership going into the future. Because after all, if Eden doesn't make any difference, we should burn it down now. We never built it as a theme park. We didn't want it to be a theme park. We actually want other people to be inspired to create Edens wherever they are. And that is the main objective. I don't know whether you guys would like to make any observation about the need for ousting people and what happens to the DNA after it's happened. Quickly.
Matt, as an observer, would you like to? Or I have comments.
I mean, I think sometimes institutions and projects become too enamored of their history, and that it is important for people to hand over the torch so that other people can see it anew. I've seen that in lots of projects in institutions. Is people don't want to leave. Sometimes they have to be forced to leave, unfortunately, but that it's healthy for projects to be, I think, to have new surges of energy and creativity brought into them.
Yeah. I do see things as a performance. So in a sense, and then it comes to an end and you have a new play in the cycle. And I think it's important to really realize, especially if you're a founder of the project, Tim, or I am of our group, that there were certain values, and that what has happened historically have colored those original values, but you can't forget those values, the values that led me as a 17-year-old to want to recreate this kind of Mount Analog adventure to the impossible. I still have those, and to keep touching base with that. At the same time, not only do times change and the project evolves, but our world is different than when you started Eden or when we started our synergists, and people also change. And so it's critical to say this is at an end, in a sense, innerly, and that we're at something new, and to use that opportunity.
Well, I think that was probably the kindest way I've ever been fired. So thank you very much.
Oh, God. Okay, this is really awkward. Sorry. I've just got maybe one more question before we do need to leave, because we've been online for a little while now. And I guess we've maybe touched on it a little bit, but do you think, and this is to Kathelin and Matt, do you think that the timing of the film, the fact that it's coming out around lockdown and people have experienced their own versions of being quarantined and isolated, has increased the public's curiosity and understanding of your story and hopefully their affinity for it?
I think it's an entry point. It's a hook to get people inside Biosphere 2, literally, figuratively. That it's not about being quarantined, but that there's some instructive lessons. And I mean, the film came out in the US just really at the beginning of the quarantine, and it was uncanny, and it was something to discuss. I think a lot of that discussion was about the transformation that the Biosphereans experienced inside, that they couldn't take Biosphere 1 for granted and all the aspects of it when they re-entered this bigger system. And then also came the uprisings around police brutality and racism around the world, one of the biggest civil rights moments in history. And I think one thing that really struck me is this idea that sustainability needs to go hand in hand with equity. And I think that also answers the question of the legacies of projects carrying on and being reimagined. It's, I think in all sorts of ways, those things have resonated with me. I think Biosphere 2 is to some extent been characterized as a utopian project. Eden also kind of points to that as well, but that I think we have to continue to imagine what a utopian future looks like, and being isolated and coming out of that isolation to engage in protest has really shifted my perspective about that in ways I wouldn't have expected while making the film. Yeah,
and I would say that the culture, the protests and the COVID thing at the basis address something which again is ecology, humans' relationship with other life forms, and what we've done, what we're doing, and that at a certain point, I hope that these hooks into it, the COVID and the protests will, and they've already well started in many quarters to completely re-examine historically, how did we get to this point, and affect change that will help other life forms as well, mass extinction and such, because the history of humanity has been about extractive economics, even from a tribal basis. It's to a large extent about extractive economics, and to look for other models. And I know, Tim, that you have in you're reaching out to other cultures and to other groups that are interested in a sustainable future. I mean, just because it has green leaves and a lot of green and animals doesn't mean it's a utopia. That's where we were born, that's where we should live. It's not an unattainable utopia. This is the planet that we were given to be stewards of.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, that was great. I just want to show you one thing. Can you see that?
No.
Is it back to front?
Reading manual.
Yeah, can you read the title out for us, Tim?
I read this in lockdown, having quoted it for large chunks of my life, and was absolutely riveted to find that book feels as fresh today as the day it was written. And I think that the highest praise I can make of you, Kathelin, and of you, Matt, is that both of you feel as fresh as the day you decide to embark on these projects. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been an utter delight, and may we see you soon, and much success with your film, Matt. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you to Tim and Kathelin and Matt so much for your time this afternoon and evening, and thank you to everyone at home watching us. The recording will be available tomorrow, so we'll get that online and we'll email that to you. So I'm sure everyone will want to re-watch and re-listen to these lovely nuggets of wisdom. As always, we're working on lining up our next event, so hopefully we'll see you again soon. And also, even though lockdown is easing in lots of parts of the UK and also in America, most of us are spending a bit more time at home. So our website's got some really amazing resources and educational tips on spending more time at home and when you're isolated. And so just like to direct you there. And if you feel like you'd like to join us and support us, either as a supporter or a member, we'd love to have you. You can find out more at edenproject.com/donate. So thank you again, everyone, for your time this evening. And like I said, if you haven't watched Spaceship Earth yet, go and rent it now. You'll love it. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.